Hello, I'm Doug Locke and Vicki Bowles is here with me again, and today we're going to be talking about data protection policies and procedures. So Vicki, why are policies so important in data protection?
They're important for a number of reasons. Number one, there are some that are actually legally required, so that's a very good reason to have them. But also, I know organisations tend to have a lot of policies, and we see it all the time where they're just documents that are written and gather dust. But actually, data protection policies can be really helpful, because if they're drafted in the right way, they can give guidance to your staff and people you're working with, and actually help people understand what it is they need to do.
And what are the data protection requirements for policies?
So the required policies are privacy notices, which we've discussed before, Doug, and why you need those. So privacy notices for people about whom you are processing personal data. You also need to have a data breach register, which is literally, as it says on the tin, a list of data breaches that you've experienced and what you've done and whether they were reported to the ICO. And it's always helpful in that case to have a little column on the end that says what you did afterwards, so what you learned from the experience. You also need a retention policy, so something that explains how long you're going to keep personal data for. I always get asked, well, how long should we keep it when I say this? And the answer is, how long do you want to keep it, essentially? If you can justify it, that's fine, but a policy that sort of explains that and how you make those decisions. Most organisations also need what's called an Article 30 record, and actually most organisations don't have one. But an Article 30 record is a record of processing activities, so it sets out the categories of data that you have about people, what you do with it, and lots of other information about those records. We've talked in a previous video about doing a data audit. If you do a data audit, you'll have an Article 30 record pretty much, so that's another good reason to do one of those and keep it up to date. The final one that's required is called an appropriate policy document. And this is a slightly strange one. It's essentially, if you are collecting certain types of what's now called special category data that used to be sensitive data, you have to have a policy that sets out in certain circumstances how you're keeping that data safe, essentially. And it's one of those things that actually most organisations have that somewhere, but they don't call it an appropriate policy document. But if you need one, it's worth knowing so that you can point people in the direction of where that information actually is, because then you can tick off that you've met that obligation.
And do you actually have to call it an appropriate policy document?
And you don't, essentially. It's absolutely fine. Lots of organisations do call it an appropriate policy document because then it's easy to find. But as long as someone in the organisation knows where that is, you can call it whatever you want.
And you mentioned a breach register. Do you have to record all breaches on the breach register?
Yes, you do. And actually, breach registers are one of the most important documents you can have. And organisations often think that if they have a breach register that's full of breaches, that's a bad thing. And it really isn't. I'm more concerned if you've got a breach register that's empty, because we are all human at the end of the day, and we all make mistakes, and breaches happen. You cannot possibly stop all types of breaches from occurring. So the important thing is, if they do happen, that you have a system that you can log them. And it also helps you identify, is there a particular weakness in the organisation? Is there a particular individual, for example, who keeps sending emails to the wrong person? Or is it not one particular individual? Is it a weakness in a department because they've got an issue with a particular piece of software or something? And as soon as you identify it, you can plug that breach. If you don't have a breach register, it's really difficult to get that type of information. So I'd really encourage you to report everything and use the register to your advantage.
Brilliant. So own up to the breaches, get them in the breach register, and actually breaches could, in a funny way, be a positive thing from the perspective of compliance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I didn't like the way you were looking at me when you were talking about a particular person who might be a consistent problem. Any other documents, policy documents and things that organisations need to have or be aware of?
So those are the core ones that you need to have, but there are lots of documents that you can have, and it depends on the size of the organisation and what you're doing as to whether these will be helpful. One of the ones that I think is helpful for most organisations, and I keep banging on about this, is practical guidance for staff. So things like, if you're asking them to put a password on their laptop, what are your expectations in terms of that password? How long should it be? Does it need special characters, capital letters? You know, all of those things that we all know and love now with the number of passwords we have. But if you've got guidance on that, put it in a practical document. If you've got CCTV, it can be really helpful to have a CCTV policy separately. So that sets out what you're recording, when, what you do with the images, how they're stored, how you access them, those kinds of questions. A security policy can also be really helpful. I talked about guidance for staff, but a more general sort of policy about how you're keeping things secure. Also, we talked about the data breach register. If you're a large organisation, it can be helpful to have a data breach plan. And these are called all sorts of things. I've seen some really interesting names. I think disaster response plan is one of my favourites. And it covered more than just data breaches. But it sets out actually who do you report to if a breach happens, and then what happens, who's responsible for investigating. And you can assign different roles to different people, and it just gives you a bit of clarity. If the worst happens, actually who's going to deal with it, and you're not scrabbling around panicking. You're there, you've got a plan, and you can go.
Brilliant. And you mentioned lots and lots of documents, policy documents and things. Where on earth could an organisation get that sort of document from?
Well, as you might expect, Doug, we have a number of template documents which we have available for businesses, and we have ones tailored to specific sectors, if that's helpful. But do get in touch with one of the team. Our details are all on our website at vwv.co.uk, and one of us will be more than happy to talk you through what we have and what you might need and how we might be able to help.
Brilliant. Vicki, as ever, thank you very much.